we have some of the best evidence for Jesus of anyone from the ancient world. Do you believe Alexander the Great was a real historical figure? Well, who doubts it? Do you believe Julius Caesar was a real historical figure? Who would doubt it? We have far more historically reliable information about Jesus than either of those two figures.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the Senior Publishing Director at Word on Fire. An exciting group of psychologists, scientists, and thought leaders are rediscovering the Bible, its beauty, its brilliance, its value. What's causing so many of them to look at the Bible with fresh eyes? That's what we're discussing today with Bishop Barron, who joins us freshly back from Rome in our studio in Rochester. Bishop, good to see you again.
Back from Rome, not sure how freshly back I am because I got a cold or something at the end of my time in Rome. I'm just kind of getting over it, so you might hear it in my voice a bit. At the end of the synod, everybody was coughing all around all the tables, so there was something going around that I got.
Now, you were there for nearly a month. I know we can't summarize all of that succinctly here, but give us a little 2-minute summary of how was the synod for you?
You know, the synod was good, Brandon. It was also exhausting. I think my illness probably is a sign of that. They really worked us. Anyone that thinks we were over there on a little Roman, holiday or something, they had us going 6 days a week from morning to night. The day ended at 7:15 or 7:30 every night. Then you go for a Roman dinner and you'd be finished at about 9 or 9:30 and then ready for bed and start all over again. So it was a workout. Best thing about it, meeting all these people from around the world. There were about 400 people in that space where we were. And, English, thank God, links you to so many people around the world. And I've got some Spanish and French. I could speak to others. But the opportunity to see the church in its universality and to make personal contact with a lot of, key figures. There were 50 cardinals at the synod. So it was like a little mini conclave. And I think for a lot of them, there haven't been a lot of consistories during the last many years. Probably the best chance for a lot of them to get to know each other was at the synod. So that was probably the best part about it. But I'll say more about it a little bit later.
On your way back from Rome, you stopped in London for this ARC conference, which featured some of the people we're going to be discussing in this episode. Tell us about that conference.
Yeah, it was sponsored by Jordan Peterson and others, and attempt to bring people together around a positive vision for the future. As nations think through politics and economics and culture, is there a positive way forward? Especially around these issues of meaning, I would say. So, I've been drawn a bit into that world through Peterson. He invited me to come and speak. Speakers gave like 10 or 12 minute interventions, real short. But I spoke about freedom and responsibility in sort of the great Catholic tradition. I was kind of tired out when I got there. It was just at the end of the synod. I was kind of sick. But, met a lot of interesting people there too. And I enjoyed that.
Peterson is one of the people featured in this new book that we've been talking about here on the podcast. It's by Justin Brierley, and it's titled The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God: Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. The first discussion we had was about the rise and the fall of the new atheism, but today I wanted to talk with you about a chapter in there titled Rediscovering the Bible, which shows how many of these secular thinkers and influencers have moved past the new atheist criticisms of the Bible and are approaching it in new and intriguing ways. Brierley starts the chapter by outlining how poorly the new atheists engaged the Bible, again in the early to mid 2000s. He says, and I'm quoting him, "Part of the problem is that the Bible's fiercest contemporary critics have tried to dismiss the Bible's credibility by reading it in the same way as the fundamentalist Christians that they often find themselves at loggerheads with." Where do you see the new atheists having gone wrong in their approach to the Bible?
In almost every way, and it's one of the stupidest elements of the new atheist movement. Full of bad arguments that they dragged up from, Feuerbach and Marx and Freud. But the way they approached the Bible was especially stupid and especially unhelpful. They betrayed almost no knowledge of sophisticated biblical scholarship, and not just in recent years. I mean, go all the way back to the beginning. Go back to people like Origen in the end of the second, early third century, Augustine, who were reading these texts in a very sophisticated, layered, interpretive manner. The new atheist approached them the way someone who has just picked up the Bible, has no knowledge of hermeneutics, of context, of history of interpretation, of theology, and just read them the way you'd read a comic book and say, well, this is obviously ridiculous. It was one of the stupidest parts, as I say, of the new atheist critique. And if one of them had just taken time, because I've said this, Brandon, to so many of their disciples online, read an elementary book of biblical interpretation. Get Bible Interpretation 101 would help you get over a lot of these really infantile objections the new atheists had to the Bible. It was a complete caricature and a construction of a straw man.
One of their main goals was to undermine the credibility of the Bible. They thought that the Bible falls, Christianity falls, and so they set these almost impossible tests for the Bible to meet in order for it to be credible. Brierly gives one example. He gives a quote from Peter Atkins, who's a very outspoken atheist scientist from Oxford. He was once in a debate with a Christian, and he said that the Bible might be able to authenticate its divine credentials if it contained even just one unmistakable scientific hypothesis, such as the second law of thermodynamics. And I'm quoting him here, Peter Atkins. He says, if I were looking in the Bible, heaven forbid, and I would expect to see something like increase in entropy is equal to Q reversible divided by temperature. If there was an equation in the Bible like that, rather than all this wishy-washy elastic writing, I might believe in it. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's ridiculous. It's stupid. No serious interpreter of the Bible has ever said from ancient times to the present that it's a kind of deus ex machina, as though God is just clearing out all of culture and all of humanity and all of the human mind and just speaking, his truth in this direct way. As Vatican II would say, the Bible is the word of God, but in the words of men. So God speaks through these culturally and historically determined figures, speaking to their own audience in their own way, but God speaks through them in a non-competitive manner. What we should not expect is, as I say, a kind of deus ex machina that's clearing all that out. God just comes bursting in. No serious interpreter of the Bible, from ancient times to the present, would say that's the way it operates. But rather, it's God non-competitively speaking in and through, in a deeply respectful way, you might say, these particular historical and cultural forms. So, to expect a scientific formula such as that, which became apparent to human beings only in the mid to late, or that one I suppose is a little earlier, but that violates this principle of God's non-competitive speaking through human words. So it just betrays an ignorance of the way the Bible's been read from the beginning.
I think it also betrays an ignorance about the purpose of the Bible, which is not a scientific textbook meant to convey scientific facts. That's what you see the new atheists claiming all the time. They criticize the science of Genesis,
right,
and therefore
but it's
the
not
whole
a scientific
thing loses
text.
credibility.
It was George Coyne, the Jesuit priest and scientist, who laid this out very simply one time by saying, look, the last book of the Bible, let's say, the Gospel of John, are written around the year 100 AD. First books of the properly scientific method written sometime in the 16th century. There's the gap. In other words, you're not going to find scientific literature anywhere in the Bible. It's not a science book. It's not conditioned by that literary form or that epistemic purpose. So it's just a stupid category error to say, oh, the science of the Bible is bad. It's not science at all that we're dealing with, but something else.
All right, so after showcasing how the new atheists missed the mark in their interpretations of the Bible, Brierly then introduces a group that he calls the New Thinkers, capital N, capital T, in opposition to the new atheists, who are taking a far more interesting approach to the Bible. He gives a few examples. I want to talk about them. One is a man named Jonathan Haidt. Haidt is a social psychologist. He's the best-selling author of several books, including The Righteous Mind and The Coddling of the American Mind. But it was while researching his book called The Happiness Hypothesis that Haidt came to appreciate the Bible as, in his own words, among the richest repositories of psychological wisdom ever assembled. He said this, "I was a standard American scientific atheist Jew. I was not predisposed to like religion. But in the course of writing that book, I came to see that religion is part of human nature. In America, religions as practiced make people better. They bind them into communities that try to elevate each other morally. When all the new atheists were writing nasty books about religion and the Bible and saying this is false, I was saying, well, actually, there's a lot of wisdom here." What do you make of Jonathan Haidt's approach?
He's getting closer. So you've got these kind of simple-minded dismissals of the Bible that are based upon just complete misunderstandings of its nature and purpose. Now with someone like Haidt, you're getting closer to it. So he's nowhere near what we would call, the revelation of God and understanding the purposes of God and salvation history and all that. But he is indeed seeing what's there to be seen. The Bible does contain, as he says, accumulated wisdom in regard to life and human relationships and psychological development. The church fathers would have seen this as one of the senses of Scripture. They call the tropological or the moral sense. We today might say the ethical sense or the psychological sense of the Bible, that you can look at the great stories of, Jonah or Noah or Abraham or Moses, and you can distill from them a great deal of wisdom about human nature, the human mind, human relationships. Think of someone like Thomas Mann that writes, this 1,500-page novel based on the story of Joseph and his brothers. Well, there's a 20th century novelist deeply attuned to the psychological dimension and finding all of this richness in the Bible. Good, it's there to be found. And you're getting closer now to reading the literature properly, because I think it does to some degree fit in that genre of psychology, of humanism, of even spirituality in a broad sense. I think someone approaching Christianity, not ready for the high-octane stuff yet, but can still sense, some perennial spiritual themes. Sure, all that's there. And he's getting into the courtyard of the Gentiles, if you want to put it that way. He's not just throwing rocks at the temple. He's gotten into the temple and has seen things that are there to be seen. I would now say to him, well, keep coming. Keep going. You'll find out more and more about the Bible.
Well, similar to Jonathan Haidt, our friend Jordan Peterson, the well-known psychologist and lecturer, sees the Bible as a source of psychological brilliance, especially in how it describes the human condition, evil, suffering. Now, Jordan is not a committed Christian, although we just heard the wonderful news that his wife Tammy will be entering the church soon. Praise be to God. But Jordan's wonder and enthusiasm for the Bible seems to grow with each passing year, and he's helping millions of other people discover the Bible for the first time. In fact, I love this little anecdote from Brierley's book. He cites a young man named Daniel James. Daniel described himself in his teenage years as a hardened anarchist atheist, but he was recently baptized in the Catholic Church. Daniel said that as a young man, he thought the Bible was a silly book. He took his cues from Lawrence Krauss's description of the Bible as a book written by ignorant Bronze Age peasants. However, he says, when he started watching Peterson's biblical lectures, he found himself blown away. And I'm quoting him here. He said, "I've never heard the Bible spoken about in that way. Jordan really just opened the door for me to understand that yes, it was written by people who lived in an era before science, but they were by no means ignorant." What I love about this, Bishop, is it illustrates how the Bible itself is becoming a new vehicle for evangelization. We're seeing people come to the faith through the Bible, and that hasn't always been the case.
No, there's so much to say there. First, Krauss's remark, which has always struck me as incredibly patronizing, stupid and incredibly patronizing, as though we're the only people that have this thing figured out. We're the only ones who have legitimate knowledge. So what? Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Michelangelo, none of Shakespeare, none of these pre-scientific people knew anything about anything. I mean, give me a break. It's breathtaking cultural arrogance. This thing about the Bronze Age and so on. Who cares when it was written? If you can discern in this text tremendous truth and wisdom, which obviously the Western tradition has. Practically every major figure up until very contemporary times drew from the Bible enormous inspiration, insight, and so on. So just the breathtaking cultural arrogance to just dismiss that as old, Bronze Age, whatever. I have a visceral reaction when I come across that little phrase, Bronze Age, because they all picked up on that, all the epigons and disciples of these guys. And it just infuriates me with its stupidity. So that's my first remark. What was the next thing, Brandon? Because I got caught up in my polemic there.
The Bible serving as this new vehicle. People are. I've heard this pattern from so many people. Jordan Peterson to the Bible to now I'm being baptized.
Yeah. Well, see, I think what Peterson, and I love this in his, and I mean this as a compliment, in his kind of innocence. He approached the Bible, I think, without knowing that much about it. But he didn't have these terrible prejudices that the new atheist types have in place. He went into it with a kind of innocence and with his finely tuned psychological mind, shaped by Jung and others, And what he found was, I think, again, a version of the tropological sense of the Bible. He found the tremendous psychological and human wisdom within it. Just recently, I saw him with Bill Maher, and he was talking about the book of Jonah, which is, one of my favorites. And he made a very simple observation about it, but it got Maher's attention, I can tell. He said the story's about what happens when you don't obey the voice of your conscience. So what Jonah, the book of Jonah, would call the call of God. Fine, I agree with that. That comes often through the conscience, which Newman called the aboriginal vicar of Christ in the soul. So when your conscience says you need to do something and you don't do it, you run the other way. What happens? Disaster for you, yes, but also disaster for everybody around you. And Peterson was reflecting on what happens to a society when, en masse, people are not following their conscience. What's going to happen is a cultural disaster and breakdown. Now, when Jonah finally gets back on beam and he follows the prompting of the Lord, he does what his conscience tells, then salvation comes to this city of Nineveh. Well, I remember Maher was taking this all and he said, I just thought it was a stupid story about a fish that swallowed this guy up. But see, there's the whole problem is Maher he got very bad formation in his Catholicism. He was raised in a Catholic school, but got very bad formation, obviously. And then just wrote that silly old Bronze Age crazy story. But Peterson, with his sort of more innocent eyes, saw this great, I'd call it psychological and ultimately spiritual depth within that story. Now, take some more steps. The Lord Jesus saying, the only sign I will give you is the sign of Jonah, who spent 3 days in the belly of the fish, and the Son of Man 3 days in the belly of the earth. Now, we'll start following that story all the way, accepting what Peterson saw. I think that's absolutely right. Now, keep going through all the senses of Scripture.
I know we've talked a lot about Jordan Peterson, in part because he represents this new generation of thinkers who are approaching the Bible with fresh eyes, with astonishment. Brierly includes a section of an interview that Peterson did on a podcast where he covered Christ's passion in the Gospels. I think this illustrates his approach to the Bible. Here's what Peterson says: "You cannot write a more tragic story. It's impossible. The injustices that Christ experienced were the aggregation of everything that people are afraid of, and that each character in this story, Mary, Pilate, Judas, Barabbas, the mob, they all speak to an aspect of our own human condition as we face death, destruction, and despair. And yet," Peterson says, "when we look harder, we see death and resurrection." How would you, again, describe this reading of the Gospels, Jordan Peterson's reading of the Gospels, and why do you think so many people find it attractive?
I would say he's not far from the kingdom of heaven. I think he's seen something very profound. And he's done, I know this, and it's from a psychological perspective, as the Son of Man is lifted up the way the bronze serpent in the desert was lifted up. Same idea. In the Old Testament, take that which has bitten you and threatens you and look at it. And when you do that, you disempower it. And that's a psychological strategy often, isn't it? Is it, okay, what's frightening you? We got to find a way for you to look at that, is to move into that space. You're afraid of heights? Okay, we got to get you up to heights gradually. It'll take some time, but you got to face that fear and you disempower it. It's the old Buddhist trope about invite your fears in for tea. And the idea there is you've now distanced yourself from your fears. Because when you're caught in anxiety, you become your fear. You know what I'm saying? You are your fear. Well, invite them in for tea means, okay, yes, there's my fear of death. Yes, there's my fear of failure. There's my fear of sickness. And I'm going to serve tea to them. You know, I've now distanced myself from that. He's seeing that now in the passion narratives, is that we are compelled to look at what frightens us. And I think he's dead right about that. You look at Jesus crucified, failure, physical suffering, psychological suffering, abandonment by your friends, institutional injustice. I've often spoken about that. Is all the forms of dysfunction are kind of on display. But then what happens when you look at those? Now, here's what I would do. I'd say yes to all of that. Now, let's keep going. Let's keep going. Because Jesus is not just a literary trope, not just an archetype of the collective unconscious. He lived. You know, he was crucified indeed under Pontius Pilate, whom we can identify historically. And he rose from the dead. In other words, there's a very powerful, divinely sanctioned warrant for our freedom from fear. So as we look at the suffering of Jesus, yes, indeed, there's a kind of psychological liberation, you might say, that comes from that. But keep going. Is God, through his graceful intervention, through raising Jesus from the dead, has definitively liberated us from all those fears. So that now we can, I can wear this cross, this awful sign, this awful instrument of torture, but I can wear it as this beautiful religious symbol. But it happened because of the grace of God. So again, I would say to Jordan, terrific. Now let's keep going.
So Justin Brierley celebrates a lot of these developments in regards to the Bible, but he also points out there's still a lot of work to do. He cites a survey from the UK, which is his home area, that found that 40% of the population of adults either believe that Jesus is a mythical character or they're uncertain whether he was a real person. So in other words, nearly half of adults in the UK think that Jesus was either a myth or a legend. What would you say to people who find the Bible interesting, maybe helpful from a psychological perspective, but doubt its historical reliability?
Read the scholars. There's an absolute consensus. Scholars left to right, skeptical to devout, affirming the real historical existence of Jesus. I don't think that's seriously disputed. Go back to the 19th century. There was a greater skepticism about it. But I think in the course of the 20th century, and even in very recent years, it's been affirmed by the whole range of scholarship that we have some of the best evidence for Jesus of anyone from the ancient world. Do you believe Alexander the Great was a real historical figure? Well, who doubts it? Do you believe Julius Caesar was a real historical figure? Who would doubt it? We have far more historically reliable information about Jesus than either of those two figures. But it's born, Brandon, of a deep prejudice, against religion. So we want to debunk and kind of re-mythologize Jesus. But it's just not faithful at all to the serious scholarship. The Gospels would fit into the genre of ancient biography. If you look at biographies from the ancient world, they're not written like ours, which are meant to be like as close to journalistic reality as possible and with 10,000 footnotes. But nevertheless, no one in the ancient world writing a biography of a great figure was presenting this figure as a myth or a legend. They're told in stylized ways, to be sure, but that we're dealing with a real figure. And look at the prologue to Luke. Luke is announcing, I'm writing basically what we call today an ancient biography. And I've consulted the sources and I put them together and here's my picture. So no, I think it's incredibly naive and opposed to the clear academic consensus to hold that Jesus didn't really exist.
Let me close with this question. It's really exciting, undeniably, to see all of these new thinkers such as Jonathan Haidt and Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland finding new beauty and meaning and wisdom in the Bible. It shows that even many non-Christians can recognize how the Bible helps us to lead better, more meaningful lives. But it comes back to the question of whether the Bible is true. Does it really matter whether the stories in the Bible are true as long as they're helpful and inspiring? What would you say?
Well, see, the Bible is a collection of books, right? Ta Biblia means the books. It's a plural noun. And so you do have, indeed, I think, in the Bible, things that are closer to what we would call straight history. You've got proverbial literature. You have the Psalms, which are poems or songs. You have epistolatory literature, like the Pauline letters. You have apocalypse, which is its own kind of genre. You have a tall tale. I think like Jonah would fit into that category of a tall tale. So it's a hodgepodge of different literary styles and genres. One of the key things Vatican II taught us was when approaching the Bible, the first question to ask is, what genre am I dealing with? What kind of text is this? Don't go at the Bible with one clunky set of interpretive lenses on. It's all straightforward history. Well, no, it's a range of different genres. Everything the Bible says is literally true. Well, how about God is a rock? There's all kinds of metaphorical, poetic language used for God. How about God, walking on the wings of the wind and all that? God walking through the garden. Well, no one thinks those are literal descriptions of God having a body and so on. So we have to be attentive to, and then Brandon, even within a biblical book, take Genesis, for example. There are a variety of genre within the book of Genesis, and we have to be sensitive to that. So that, I think, is maybe one of the most important points to make about biblical interpretation. You're dealing with a library, not a single book written in one genre.
If I can press that question a little further, though, and narrow it down to the Gospels, because I think this is where I find it most intriguing, is again, you have people like Haidt and Peterson fascinated by the person of Jesus as a psychological symbol or archetype. For Jesus, does it matter whether Jesus actually existed, whether he actually rose from the dead or not?
Absolutely, because, again, go to the genre question. What's the genre of the Gospels? It's ancient biography. And ancient biographies were not trading in legendary mythic material. And there's all kinds of clues interior to the text itself. And then in the witness of the first Christians, that they're dealing, of course, with a real figure and things that happened to him and so on. So it matters immensely. If Jesus becomes simply an archetype, the way he does, for example, in Kant, and I always thought with Jordan Peterson, I've written about this, there's a sort of Kantian tendency in him to reduce Jesus to the archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God. That's Kant's language. So he's a literary trope, an archetype. And we can derive all kinds of important moral truths and otherwise from that. But no, it matters immensely that Jesus was and indeed is a real person.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Every episode, we share one question for Bishop Barron. If you have one, you can send it in to us at the website askbishopbarron.com. Today, we have one from the other side of the world. A young woman named Marissa from Vietnam has a good question about God's nature. Here's Marissa.
Hi, Bishop Barron. I'm Marissa from Ho Chi Minh City of Vietnam, and I'm 16 years old. And Bishop, I've been wondering, how can Jesus at the same time a God and a human being? Like, by my research, I found that God's nature and human nature have many differences. Thank you for your time and have a good day.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You're perfectly in line with the instincts of the fathers at the Council of Chalcedon, who said, famously, in Jesus, two natures come together, divine and human, but without mixing, mingling, or confusion. They knew, as you correctly know, that divine nature and human nature are incompatible. We say God is infinite, we think human beings are finite. God is immaterial, we're material. God is eternal, we're in time. So they are, and that's why The incarnation does not mean that God turns into a creature, that he stops being God and turns into a creature, or that a creature just turns into God, leaving its creatureliness behind. No, we would say rather, God takes to himself a human nature so as to use for his, I would say, iconic purposes. That's to say that the human nature of Jesus, which is distinct from his divine nature, but is used by that by the divine person as an expression, as an iconic representation in the world. So you don't have to violate the laws of logic. You don't have to say God turns into a creature, or a creature stops being a creature and turns into God. But the two natures come together in their distinctiveness, now in the unity of the divine person. And that just means that metaphysical principle that instantiates the two natures. Your instinct is really good. And the church never asks us to abandon our minds, our logical intuitions when accepting the dogmas of the faith.
Well, as we wrap up here, we are excited to share with you a new book from our Word on Fire Spark imprint of books for young readers. This new one is called The Golden Key and Other Fairy Tales by George MacDonald. Beautifully designed. Shout out to Nick Fredrickson and our design team. Enter what G.K. Chesterton called the glorious fairyland of George MacDonald. This delightful collection of stories will introduce the reader to the forgotten father of fantasy fiction. According to C.S. Lewis, there is hardly any other writer who seems to be closer or more continuously close to the spirit of Christ himself than George MacDonald, and MacDonald deeply influenced the Christian fantasy writers after him, including J.R.R. Tolkien and Madeleine L'Engle. This book includes 3 of MacDonald's fairy stories, The Golden Key, The Light Princess, and Little Daylight. It's a beautiful cloth-bound edition that features stunning full-color illustrations and an introduction by the editor of Word on Fire Spark, Haley Stewart. So you can find this book at wordonfire.org/key. And again, it's titled The Golden Key and Other Fairy Tales by George MacDonald. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.
Peace be with you. Friends, our first reading for this weekend is taken from the marvelous book of Proverbs. You can find that in your Bibles right after the book of Psalms. It's part of the so-called wisdom literature, so these texts that are more poetic in nature. Proverbs is associated with King Solomon, who's the paradigmatically wise figure in the Old Testament. It's made up of a series of aphorisms or brief statements, mostly about the moral life, although you can find some pretty high theologizing too. Go to Proverbs chapter 8, and you'll see reflections on Lady Wisdom, who was with God at the beginning when he created all things. And that had a good amount of influence on the later sort of logos speculation of the church. So the book of Proverbs, marvelous. It's a great book to kind of peruse. You don't have to, read it cover to cover, but you can find wisdom in these aphorisms. Well, the reading for today is taken from the very end of Proverbs, from chapter 31, the final chapter. Very interesting how a book dedicated to wisdom ends with a kind of hymn of praise to a wise, industrious, resourceful wife. It ends with singing the praise of this marvelous woman. We could speak, if you want, of a kind of feminism within the book of Proverbs, since it ends this way, and Lady Wisdom is identified in Proverbs chapter 8. But I don't want to focus so much on that theme today, but rather on what I'd call a theology and spirituality of work. It's a theme that's very dear to St. Pope John Paul II, but one that we don't reflect on, I don't think, adequately. That work itself, in its various manifestations, is not something extraneous to the spiritual life, not something secular that we do alongside of our spiritual interests, but in fact is filled up with spiritual power. When I was coming of age, I can't tell you how many times I heard this little adage. It's not about what you do, it's who you are, right? It's not what you do, it's not doing that matters so much, it's being that matters. Well, I'll admit there's something to that distinction. Sure, I get it, At the same time, I've always felt that distinction is simplistic, as though we can simply divorce our being from our action, our being from what we do, when in point of fact, I think our being is deeply influenced by our acting and by our doing. Work has a lot to do with the kind of people that we become. Again, another John Paul II theme. In our moral choices, he said, we make ourselves the people that we are becoming. And in a similar way, in the work that we do, we become the people that we are meant to be. Now, here's the first thing to think about now under this rubric. Adam, according to the book of Genesis, was given work to do, not simply after the fall, but before the fall. So there's a tendency to think, well, yes, after sin entered the world, then work is this kind of terrible burden. We have to labor by the sweat of our brow, etc. Now, I don't deny for a second that work, like everything else in life, became worse after the fall. It became more difficult and complicated. That's true. However, remember, Adam was given work to do before the fall. Therefore, it belongs to what's good and beautiful and positive in our way of being human. Someone that was very prominent in our country some decades ago, the political commentator William F. Buckley Jr., once said this, and I pass this advice on to many people who struggle with depression. He said, industry is the enemy of melancholy. Industry is the enemy of melancholy. In other words, when you're feeling down, one of the great things you can do is get to work. Get to work on a project. It tends to make you feel better. Now, why? Why? Because work engages the powers. Think of your powers of mind, your powers of will, your powers of creativity and imagination. All of it is awakened when we give ourselves over to a project. I'll give you a silly example from my own life. Much of my life is kind of cerebral. I'm preparing things like this, like a sermon. I'm writing an article. I'm going and giving a talk somewhere. Something I find really satisfying, no kidding, is doing the dishes. So especially during COVID, I've been home more often. And so I've sort of made it my responsibility to do the dishes after dinner. And you say, oh, it's kind of drudgery and it must be really tiresome. Not really. For me, I kind of enjoy it. Here's this big mess of dishes, and then through, simple effort of my hands and so on, I can bring all that to order. There's something satisfying about it. Now, extrapolate from that to all these different forms of work that we engage in and how powerful they are, how much they awaken what is best in us. Think of it this way too. John Paul II made this point many times. In our work, we become collaborators with God, collaborate, to work with. Could God accomplish all his purposes on his own? Well, yeah, of course he could. He's God. But God gives us the extraordinary privilege of cooperating with his work. He draws us into this activity so that we can, with him, bring about a greater world. Okay, now with all that in mind, it's kind of a general theology or spirituality of work. I want you to look at this wonderful passage from the 31st chapter of Proverbs as the author sings the praise of this industrious, intelligent woman. Listen. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She's like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. What I love about that, yes, she's working with willing hands, but she's also seeking wool and flax. No one's just handing her what she needs for her work. No, she goes out, with a sense of industry and purpose, and she finds what she needs. Like the ships of the merchant. How wonderful, this sort of exotic image of bringing goods from far away. Well, that's what this industrious woman does through her work. Furthermore, she rises while it's still night and provides food for her household. Think what it was like in the ancient world to provide food for your household. I mean, I can make my breakfast and lunch in a couple of minutes because it's all there. The eggs and bread and cold cuts and soup, it's all there. I just have to throw it in the microwave or in a toaster and it's done. But imagine now in ancient times when you had to provide food for your family. You had to go out and hunt it, or you had to grow it and you had to prepare it. So of course she's up in the middle of the night, every day working, engaging her powers for the sake of her family. How about this? I'm still continuing with this passage. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hand, she plants a vineyard. Well, this woman's not just, doing manual labor. She's doing that. But she's a business person, going out there and looking at different options. She considers this field. She buys it. She invests. She's engaging not just her manual powers, but her intellectual powers. John Paul II is strong on that too. I couldn't help but think, with this great stress on hands in this passage, the work of hands and the fruit of your hands. One of my great heroes, Bob Dylan, has that marvelous song, Forever Young, that has the line, "May your hands always be busy, may your feet always be swift, may you have a firm foundation when the winds of changes shift." That's a deeply biblical idea. May your hands always be busy, engaged, active. Then how about this now? A different type of handiwork. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. How wonderful. The same hands that prepare food and work the fields are now reaching out to those in need. Perhaps it's the fruit of her industry that gives her the wealth that she's able now to share. That too, everybody, is a type of work, isn't it? Work on behalf of the poor. Terrific. She does that too. Then this. Her clothing is described, and it's described as being of fine linen and purple. That means it's a very high level. We'd say like it's a very fancy suit of clothes. But listen, but strength and dignity are her true clothing. Terrific, isn't it? So she is wearing fine clothes, but the real beauty of her clothing is in her strength and dignity. How does she become strong? Through work. Where's her dignity come from? From her work. You know, those who suffer with unemployment, and that's a curse in our society. What they feel is not just the financial burden of that, but it's the loss of dignity that people often feel when they lose their work, they lose their livelihood. That's where it comes from. Then this, not just physical work, not just investment, not just giving to the poor, but listen to this. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She also does intellectual work. John Paul II talked about, and he was a man that knew both manual labor when he was a young man, and then a lot of intellectual labor. Philosopher, a theologian, a writer, a teacher. He spoke about his desk as his intellectual workbench. I've always liked that because I do a lot of work like that. And when I sit down at my office at my computer, I often think of John Paul II's line. This is your intellectual workbench. You put in a good many hours of work on a sermon or an article or a book. What are you doing? Well, listen again. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She does the work of the mind. Terrific, terrific. And then here's the wonderful coda with which the reading ends for today. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is fleeting. True, isn't it? Oh, that person's charming. Man, that could be deceitful. Maybe they're charming because they want something out of you. They're charming because they're playing a game. Beauty, we all know that, it's fleeting. Even those beautiful people, how long does it last? Not that long. But listen. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands. Let her works praise her in the city gates. You see what he's doing now at the end is correlating all of this wonderful work that this woman does. Intellectual, moral, physical, all this work by which she realizes herself, and he puts it now under the aegis of the fear of the Lord. Quite appropriate, quite appropriate. It's under God that we do the work which conquers our melancholy, yes indeed, but more than that, which awakens our powers, but more than that, gives us the dignity God wants us to have. So, in light of this beautiful reading, could I invite everybody listening to me now, when you go off to work, whatever that is, I mean from doing the dishes to going off to your office in a high-rise building, to caring for your family, to intellectual work, I don't care what it is. But think of this now as collaborating with the purposes of God. See it as a spiritual act, a moral act, an act that brings you into union with the purpose of God. And God bless you.